Hello. Hello, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to this session, PFAS, What Kentucky Farmers Need to Know. My name is Natalie Ryder, and I am the Associate Director of the Organic Association of Kentucky. I will be moderating this session today. A couple of announcements for you all. If you are an extension agent or are getting a pesticide applicator's license, there are CEUs, continuing education units, available if you go to the registration table at the front of the facility here. So please make sure you go and sign the clipboard there on the right corner of the table to get your points. There are fire exits in the back. You can see the big exit signs back there. Wanted to remind you all of that. If you have been to a session before with Oak or today, we will have session feedback cards at the end, so it's very important that you fill these out. Give us your thoughts and help give us ideas for future programming and conferences. You'll submit those to me or someone in the back. I'll let you know at that time. This session is unique in that we are using the Slido app or website, so you'll see these papers distributed around. There's a QR code there. Throughout the session, you can submit a question on this site. You can either scan this QR code or you can put in slido.com, and the code is OAK 2025. You'll select your room, which you'll see the title of this session, starting with PFAS. Type in your question, and if you don't have a question but you're interested in looking at other people's questions, you can actually vote questions up that really interest you. And towards the end of the session, I will be facilitating those questions among our wonderful panelists here. Let's see. Speaking of, I will be reading the bios of our 4 speakers today. We are joined by some amazing professionals here. I'll start with Tom Fitzgerald. 2 of our speakers will be virtual, so Fitz is one of those. Tom Fitzgerald is the former director of and current counsel to the Kentucky Resources Council. KRC is a nonprofit environmental advocacy organization providing free legal, strategic, and policy assistance to individuals, organizations, and communities concerning environmental quality, resource extraction, energy, and utility issues. Fitz is also an adjunct professor of energy and environmental law at the Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville. Representative Nima Kulkarni represents Kentucky's 40th House District, which includes the University of Louisville and Churchill Downs. As a legislator, Nima is focused on issues of economic, social, racial, and environmental justice, and has dedicated her time to helping the most vulnerable Kentuckians. Recently, she has focused on legislation aimed to address forever chemicals in the air, water, and soil through the lens of health outcomes, which is a unique approach to this issue. Dr. Jason Unrein is an environmental toxicologist and university research professor in the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences in the Martin Gatton College of Agriculture, Food, and Environment, and the director of the Kentucky Water Research Institute at the University of Kentucky. For over 25 years, he has conducted research on the environmental chemistry and toxicology of emerging and legacy contaminants, including engineered nanomaterials, trace elements, and disinfection byproducts. And finally, Dr. Jamie Wise, who will also join us virtually, is an assistant professor of pharmacology and toxicology at the University of Louisville. Using a one environmental health approach, Dr. Wise's research integrates human, animal, and ecosystem health to gain insight into how environmental contaminants such as heavy metals and per- and poly-fluoroalkyl substances contribute to disease. Her studies investigate how sex and age modulate toxicant-related diseases while promoting advances in risk assessment and management. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers. Dr. Wise.
So I'm hoping that everybody can hear me. Like I said, right now I'm only seeing my screen. But thank you to all of the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. I'm not going to actually go into any of the information about the research that I'm doing. I'm actually here to give you some background about these forever chemicals. I'm going to talk to you about the good, the bad, and the ugly of how things happen here with PFAS. And so, what's really important is like, why am I here and why am I talking to you? And as was noted, I am an environmental toxicologist at the University of Louisville. And one of the amazing things is that it brings me back to home. Essentially, I grew up in a small rural community in Maine, actually Fairfield, Maine, which can be seen in the map here in the upper corner. And right here on the Green Road, which is in the middle, there was a dairy farm. And in 2020, I had people from Maine in this area call me and say, Jamie, I saw this thing in the paper and I'm really worried about this local farmer. He's, somebody that we all knew in the community. And come to find out that the milk from his cows that he had given to the local grocery stores tested really high for PFAS. And that was in 2020. And they wanted to know what PFAS was and if they should be concerned. And so this kind of started to snowball. And then in 2021, there was actually another issue that came out in Maine, which was a do not eat advisory for deer and turkey. This was taken out in 6 counties, specifically in the same region of Fairfield, the small rural community I grew up in, where they actually found really high levels of PFAS in the meat of the deer and the turkey. And this is really important to the people in this area because many of them use the deer and the turkey to sustain the food for their families. And this again was in 2021. And come to find out, this was the results of spreading biosolids, not only on the farm fields, but also just on the local fields to get rid of them. And this came from a paper plant that wasn't too far down the road. So this is how I became involved. People in my home state became really aware and concerned about this. And again, it's obviously become a really big problem in Kentucky. And some of the other panelists are going to talk about that today. But that's why I'm here talking to you about this. And so I'm going to use kind of the analogy of the old spaghetti westerns that Clint Eastwood was in, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is the history, the discovery, the uses, and why PFAS came about. I'm going to talk a little bit about their widespread contamination and why they're called forever chemicals, and then kind of lead into the health consequences. They're really extremely difficult to get rid of and have been linked to a number of negative health outcomes. So what are PFAS? Well, PFAS is the short term for per and poly-fluoroalkyl substances. PFAS is a lot easier to say. When I first made this slide about 3 years ago, this comprised about 9,000 man-made chemicals in this one class. So the takeaway from this part of the slide is essentially that it has gone from 9,000 to 15,000 chemicals that are in this class of PFAS, but that they're also man-made. And that's probably the biggest take home right now. Yes, they're man-made. They were actually accidentally discovered in 1938 by DuPont chemists Jack, Robert, and Roy, which are depicted here in this photo. And it was actually written down in their lab notebook, which you can see in this photo, that they found this chemical. It didn't dissolve in anything. It didn't react with anything. And it was super expensive to make. So by the time these chemists got done with the chemical, they actually wrote down in the notebook that this was a useless polymer and they weren't going to use it. Well, this useless polymer, again, didn't dissolve in anything and didn't react with anything, so it was stable. It was found to repel oil, grease, water, and heat, but they weren't sure what to do with it. Well, when World War II came around, it actually saved this useless polymer. And what happened is that these properties that I just mentioned resulted in it being used in the development of the atomic bomb. And by 1941, that's when it was first patented as the brand name Teflon, which is C8, and which is what most people are really familiar with. And it didn't take very long from Teflon to go from wartime to dinner time. And that's where you have your Teflon nonstick pans. And by the 1950s, this was found in consumer and industrial products. And these are some of the commercials and advertisements that were found that you can see. They actually called it the Happy Pan. And Teflon is really well known as with DuPont. And so from wartime to dinner time, PFAS became more prevalent. And by the 1960s, another property of PFAS came out, and that's the fact that it's a surfactant. And that allows it to be put in firefighting foams, and that has also become a really big issue. And in these photos here, what I want you to be able to see is on the bottom photo, that's actually at an air base where they do their practices. And essentially that firefighting foam containing the PFAS gets into the waterways as well directly. So that's an example of contamination. And so by the 1970s, the use of PFAS significantly expanded into different industries. And by the 2000s, it was globally distributed. And that became a huge issue. It was found in both industry as a result of many of the processes that it is used for, as well as consumer products. And what I want to point out here is a couple of the reasons or things that it is used for in consumer products. One of the biggest ones that is known is the fast food packaging, the microwave popcorn, pizza boxes. Again, this is the anti-grease properties. And something that may be of interest to you is, when we were younger, and not very long ago actually, that these packages, none of the grease went through them, the pizza boxes, the wrappers, anything like that. And what you might notice more recently is that the grease is actually starting to seep through not only your fast food packaging, but some of these consumer products. And that's because they've actually banned PFAS from being used in them. So just something to keep in mind. Then in our cosmetics and shampoo, eye makeup, nail polish, and this has been found by a number of universities. And a study that was done in the University of Toronto did a lot of characterization of this and found that, for example, over 60 lip products had PFAS levels in them. So this is just a simplified version of where some of these PFAS chemicals are being in our consumer products, in our cosmetics. And these properties, the stability, the fact that it is a surfactant and being used in firefighting foams, what makes them so special? Why do they have these properties and why are they so widely used? Well, as a biology student, I learned right off that structure determines function. So the structure of the chemical can determine how it is used. And this is just a really basic, simplified version of what a PFAS chemical would look like. So these C's that are here, these are the carbon, and this is a carbon backbone. And the green F's are the fluorines. And so these are fluorine attached to carbons. And this is the green part of this figure. And then the functional head, which is just this hydrophilic area, is actually something that changes across different PFAS. But for the purpose of this, the point is that this carbon C to fluorine bond is one of the strongest bonds in chemistry, and it's actually not found naturally in the environment. And so that's where they get the name forever chemicals, because this bond cannot be broken very easily. And because of that, PFAS are widespread in the environment. Again, I mentioned industry, the use in consumer products, firefighting foam, and back to my encounters in the state of Maine, where the use of biosolids and waste infrastructure led to its accumulation in air. We'll find itself in the soil and in water, and all of this impacts farmers and then also human exposures. And so more of that and the sources of PFAS, the movement in the environment, and the mitigation measures will be talked about panelist Jason. And I'll hand that part over to him. But I do want to point out, I'm really interested in the drinking water exposures. And to me, this map from the Environmental Working Group says a lot. So this is actually from 2024. The map from 2022 probably had half of the number of blue and purple dots on it. And these dots are just showing you where there was measurable levels of PFAS in the drinking water. The purple is military, and the two blue colors are the drinking water that had the PFAS measurements in it. But what's remarkable is, according to the Environmental Working Group, that 143 million people and communities throughout the United States have drinking water that have tested positive for PFAS. And that's just ones that have been tested. And so why do we care about this? Why do we care about these chemicals getting in the environment, the air, soil, and water, and our exposure? And that's where the spaghetti Western comes in. The bad outweighs the good in this case. So nearly all Americans at this point, including newborn babies, have measurable levels of PFAS in their blood. So again, I mentioned the good. They were discovered and they're used for a reason. They repel oil, grease, water, heat, and they're stable. And because of this, that's why they're used. However, that bad component of them really outweighs what's going on. They bioaccumulate, so that means they can build up in our bodies, they can build up in the environment. They migrate easy in the water and in the air, and they are very toxic. And because of that, they have a number of negative health effects that are still in their infancy of being investigated and discovered. And these include decreased immune responses, birth defects, different types of cancer, including kidney and reproductive. And the list goes on, and the research is, again, still in its infancy. So the companies have been hiding this health risk for PFAS for a long time, and there's actually quite a history. In 1956, Stanford University actually found that PFASs were binding to proteins in the blood, and what that means is essentially it was interfering and reacting with biological parts of our body. So that in itself renders itself to being a potential health risk, starting in 1956. In 1965, DuPont itself, the one that actually implemented Teflon, found that it caused liver damage and increased spleen size in rats. And by 1978, Teflon again themselves said that the different PFAS chemicals should be regarded as toxic. And it wasn't until 1989 that they actually did a study that they saw that the cancer rates among the workers for the company actually increased. So all of these things came about. And what began as a miracle of modern chemistry actually became now a national crisis. And this was a quote from the Environmental Working Group. And this is really well depicted. If you haven't seen the movie Dark Waters, it's based on a book by Rob Billett, who is the lawyer that kind of brought PFAS to the forefront. And it's a really good book and a really interesting movie, and I recommend that you watch it if you haven't. But the point is where are we now? And this is where we have two more speakers on the panel that will also be hitting these points. There is a changing regulatory climate. There have been a number of lawsuits since the one that Rob Billett put into place, and the development and use of new PFAS has also come in here. For example, Gen X is a smaller chain PFAS chemical that actually is thought to cause less health effects, but now is showing to be more. So when Tom and Nima come into play, they're going to talk more about these legislative updates, what can farmers do to get involved, and a call to action, what can be done. And I want to end by saying that, I don't know that you guys can see this, but it actually shows. So March 4th of 2022 was the first time that that the PFAS Chemical Awareness Day started in Kentucky. So this is a day where we spread awareness to the citizens of Kentucky about PFAS. And this is the first time this happened was in this photo. And you can see Nima is actually in this photo with me and Rob Billett. And then there were two people, Sammy and Elijah, who actually have done a number of movies around Gen X and firefighting foam and PFAS that were remarkably amazing. And so for that, I will say thank you. And please let me know if you have any questions. And I look forward to the rest of the panel discussion.
All right. Do I just advance it or? All right, thank you so much for that great introduction and sort of setup and information about the history and the health effects. So what I'd like to talk about a little bit more is what are some of the sources you need to think about in terms of PFAS in the environment from the perspective of a farmer and just, as an ordinary person in the home. And then how might you be exposed? And then I just want to talk a little bit about what you can or unfortunately can't do with land or soil that's contaminated with PFAS, and talk about a couple of the things that are going on in terms of assessing the risk from biosolids application and some of the resources that might be available. So, PFAS are extremely mobile in the environment. So for that reason, going from industrial sites, there are many instances where PFAS have leached into the groundwater, run off into surface water. A lot of these industries discharge wastewater to wastewater treatment plants. And so PFAS tend to be concentrated into biosolids. About half of those are land applied in the United States. Small percentage are incinerated, and an awful lot go to landfills. So then we have leachate from those landfills that are then going back into the wastewater treatment plant. Direct discharge into surface waters, And then, of course, with the biosolids land application, because the compounds are so mobile, they can infiltrate into groundwater. We can have plant uptake, and then, of course, uptake into humans eating the plants or grazing animals. And that's where we've really seen a lot of these instances on farms where it's actually grazing operations where PFAS end up in dairy products and meat. So that seems to be one of the primary routes, possibly because pastures are where a lot of the biosolids are just, applied, sewage sludge. We know much less about airborne exposure to PFAS, so we know that, in some recent studies, a large proportion of PFAS in landfills are actually emitted into the air. We have a lot of knowledge gaps. And, I should preface this, I'm not a PFAS specialist here. I've done a lot of work with biosolids, but this problem is becoming so pervasive that basically almost every environmental scientist is becoming involved in this in one way or another. And part of it is because there's so many use cases for these chemicals. It's not one chemical, it's a whole class of chemicals. It's like saying, pesticides in the environment. And because of that, we have all these different routes. So, it was mentioned all the different consumer products that contain these. A lot of the chemicals from consumer products go into sewage that then goes to the wastewater treatment plant. And so even those consumer product PFAS are, ending up on agricultural fields through biosolids application. And so the cycle goes on and on. Unfortunately, in terms of mitigation, I don't have very good news for you because bacteria really don't break these compounds down. There are some limited transformations of them, but they end up as sort of end products that essentially never break down. So there's a lot of intense research going on trying to find bacteria and other methods for possibly breaking them down, but there's really nothing that can help in the real world at this point. There are some sorbents that can be applied to land that basically immobilize the PFAS compounds. So there's a product called Rembind, a type of product, granulated activated carbon, that's used in treating drinking water. Unfortunately, I did some back of the envelope calculations, and to treat an acre furrow slice of land using these sorbents would actually cost more than the market value of the property. So you're talking like $50,000 to $100,000 per hectare just for the sorbent itself, and not the cost of mixing it with the soil. So at the end of the day, removal of the soil or some kind of remediation that costs more than the market value of the land is the only thing that can be done. So for a lot of these dairy operations, unfortunately, it's been game over for them if PFAS contamination has been found on the land. Let me jump back a little bit. On the drinking water side, there's a lot more effective technologies that are more cost effective, although expensive, but they don't destroy the PFAS compounds. They simply bind it to some of these sorbents like granulated activated carbon that I mentioned, and then they have to be regenerated. Well, there are a lot of questions about when you regenerate these sorbents, then where do the PFAS go from then? Or, does it end up in a landfill and then just keep cycling around? So at the University of Kentucky, we're working on some technologies that can actually degrade the PFAS compounds, but it's all experimental technology at this point. And all of those methods are very energy intensive at this point, so they're not quite sustainable yet. So I just wanted to kind of give you some indications of things that you might want to pay attention to in terms of facilities that might be around your property. Any firefighting facilities, so Jamie mentioned that the aqueous film forming foam that firefighters had used. It's kind of strange. This reminds me of stories of my parents' generation with DDT, but when I was a kid, there was this like Christmas in July thing where the firefighters filled a whole baseball field full of this stuff, and we went and played in it. So it kind of reminds me of the pictures that I show my students in class of, them dusting, people at summer camps with DDT. Airports, because those are the kinds of firefighting measures that are needed to combat fires, for aircraft fires, military bases. It's been a big problem with groundwater contamination around military bases for some of the same reasons. Manufacturing facilities. A lot of these facilities may not even know that they're using lubricants that contain PFAS and so forth. They're just so pervasive in many different use cases. Wastewater treatment plants, if you're downstream. Turns out electroplating facilities, there are lots of these facilities, electroplating and metal finishing facilities all over the place, and they use PFAS as sort of an anti-misting, anti-foaming agent in the electroplating baths. Food processing facilities, so Jamie talked about the food packaging. There are studies coming out showing in the wastewater food processing facilities a lot of these compounds, and then of course landfills. So, we're concerned about discharge into surface water. The work that the Department of Environmental Protection in Kentucky has done has shown that they can be detected in almost the vast majority of the surface water samples that they've tested. Large proportion of the groundwater. So particularly along the Ohio River, the PFAS are detected in almost all of the samples in close proximity to the Ohio River from groundwater. So in addition to the ground application of sewage sludge or biosolids, less attention has been paid to irrigation water, but I think that's something that, as a farmer, you might want to think about, if you're irrigating. Airborne releases, there have been cases in Kentucky where land has been contaminated from facilities through airborne deposition and so forth. So in terms of how people are exposed, obviously drinking water, and that's pretty much the easiest thing for us to remediate in terms of treatment. Direct contact with these consumer products, household dust. It's been shown that household dust is laden with the compounds. And then, I mentioned the meat and dairy products seem to be a real pain point in terms of exposure, fish and seafood and so forth. We know much less about direct inhalation from the air. So in terms of testing, it's extremely expensive to test. So just testing one soil sample or one water sample is several $100s. I did find out doing some research for this conference that NRCS has a program, if you go to the farmers.gov website, that they have to help pay for testing for PFAS. And there's another USDA program I found out about that apparently compensates you for cows that are contaminated, but I'm not sure that that's really the issue if the land itself is contaminated. Feel free to reach out to me if this is something that you want to find more information about getting testing done, or if I can help in any way, or if you have more questions, you can just search for my name or the Kentucky Water Research Institute and go to our website and get in touch with me that way. I'd be happy to help or answer any questions that I can. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I know we're in the post-lunch slump, but thank you all for being here and being awake. I hope you can see me. Sometimes these podiums are most of me. But thank you again for being here, and thank you to the Organic Association of Kentucky for including this very important topic for discussion. It's obviously a topic that is top of mind for you all here, and is increasingly top of mind for policymakers and stakeholders that have anything to do with the environment or public health. And so I am very grateful for this topic and the attention that it's getting and the momentum that it's going to build in terms of finding a solution. Because fundamentally we are hurting Kentucky families, and we're hurting families all across this nation and around the world that are being exposed to these chemicals. Okay, was it this button? The big one. The big one, okay. All right, so I'm gonna try to do something called a policy perspective, and I wanna thank Jamie, Dr. Young, and Dr. Unrein for their presentations as well. I think one of the first things I'm gonna do is just kind of go through a quick overview, and I'm not gonna belie whatever the doctors have already gone through before, but I wanted to kind of talk about essentially what Dr. Unrein outlined, right? So how do PFAS contaminate farmland? It's through biosolids largely. There's also contaminated irrigation water, soil absorption, leaching to groundwater, plant uptake, and animal exposure, and of course the air emissions as well. This is going to look familiar to you all. I love this slide. I send it to people because it's such an easy way for folks to follow kind of the path of PFAS in our environmental cycle and see exactly where it could end up. I'm glad that scientists use this as well, and it's not just lay people. But I want to also kind of highlight the fact that in each of these areas, right, at different points in that cycle is when we need to sample and test for PFAS. And from a policy perspective, one of the things that we've got to figure out, it's expensive, it is difficult to get buy-in from landowners and farmers because maybe they don't want to know. I mean, people are afraid of farms getting shut down, certifications being taken away. So it's a scary prospect to have somebody come and take a sample, or for you to be forced to take a sample on any level, which is why it's going to take buy-in, because fundamentally we don't want to grow crops on soil that's contaminated. We don't want to be feeding livestock anything contaminated with PFAS, because ultimately, as you've seen, it will end up in us. It will end up in future generations. It's bioaccumulative. So air emissions testing at facility sites, for instance, testing at industrial wastewater sites, industrial stormwater sites, and municipal wastewater sites are all places we should be testing in an ideal world regularly so we can figure out the concentrations. And these might differ, right? If you're close to, for instance, a facility that produces PFAS chemicals, the concentrations may be higher than if you aren't near a facility that has direct discharge into the water or the air or the soil. But it's important to note that in that PFAS cycle, these are the important points where we need to be taking samples and testing. So I want to talk a little bit about what other states have done. And again, in recent years, so I would say in the past 3 or 4 years, there has been a lot of attention on PFAS and how states might approach just identification of where PFAS is, remediation, mitigation, you name it, or even just education of what PFAS are, because the compounds change, right? So you have the initial C8 compounds, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Unrein, it's the 8-chain carbon, the 8-carbon chain formula. But what happens is industries, as soon as you ban that particular compound, will just shorten them or change them. And so you have different generations of PFAS, which are equally toxic or could be more toxic. We have not had enough time to gauge any of those impacts, but that are still being circulated, again, in things that are water repellent, that are heat resistant, and that are also continuing to be discharged and emitted into our air, water, and soil. So here are a few approaches, and as you can see, not every state approaches the issue of PFAS consistently. So some might be looking at imposing limits or monitoring limits of PFAS in our drinking water or in our wastewater. You've got states like California that have banned PFAS in food packaging and firefighting foam. We have in Kentucky banned it from firefighting foam in 2019. Maine has prohibited it in PFAS-containing sludge for use as fertilizer. And then Vermont and New York, so Vermont has expanded testing to include private wells and small water systems, which is critical. And then New York also conducts regular testing and, importantly, remediation in contaminated areas. So it is really, really important for us as policymakers, for states, and for our government, slow as our federal government has been to respond to the issue of PFAS contamination, but testing and figuring out where the concentrations are is critical. So this is a map from an organization called Safer States. Has anyone heard of this organization? So this is a national alliance of environmental health organizations and coalitions from across the country. And so they are working specifically on issues of toxic chemicals and safeguarding our planet from them, so toxic chemicals including PFAS, but not limited to PFAS, and finding solutions from corporate, government, and community sectors. So it's going to take buy-in from all of these different stakeholders for us to address this issue. So essentially this map shows that 30 states in our country have adopted over 150 policies related to PFAS, and that 23 states have introduced over 100 policies to date. So I want to very briefly, as I was looking through all of the information that Safer States has, and I would suggest going to their website because they have a ton of data and a ton of model policies, which I will certainly be availing myself of in future legislative sessions. But I wanted to just briefly talk about these pathways that they've laid out, which includes transparencies. So that means having manufacturers disclose ingredients in products and processes that might include toxic chemicals such as PFAS, phasing out the bad, so phasing out inherently hazardous chemicals, promoting safer solutions, so creating incentives or mandates that can encourage the development of safer materials and alternatives to PFAS, accountability, so again, manufacturers, that's going to be probably the tallest order, holding the actual manufacturers of these chemicals accountable, and how do we stop them from doing so. But they all tie together, because if they can find a safer alternative, then we can take that excuse away. Safer management systems, so prioritizing waste reduction and prevention, and chemical recycling, so the idea of what happens to PFAS if it's sort of either kept at bay, but it doesn't ever break down, so how do we mitigate that? And setting the stage. So setting the stage specifically for future policy action, which includes comprehensive strategies for prevention, mandating testing, and requiring agencies to conduct studies on environmental and health impacts. So to date, you hear a lot about levels, right? PFAS levels in our water, safe limits, and things like that. But honestly, there is no safe, right, number of PFAS contamination. And so one of the things that we need to look at is how do we create a strategy based on these sorts of foundational issues and ideas in conjunction with each other, so that we're not just looking at a number that we have to meet or fall below the threshold, because that also has been used as an excuse by stakeholders, including the government, manufacturers, and disseminators of these PFAS chemicals. I want to talk about Maine, Dr. Young's home state, because they have been leading the charge and leading the way in terms of policy-specific approaches to PFAS. And I think that's a lot of words, I know, but I want you to kind of just go through everything that Maine has done on a state level. It was the first state in the country to ban PFAS in all products in 2021, and it's again led the way with regard to state-level policies to address contamination, including in drinking water, products with intentionally added PFAS, and pesticides. One of the things that they have also done is having a kind of phased out approach. So for instance, PFAS in products program requires reporting. So if you have intentionally added PFAS in your products and you are selling them or distributing them in Maine, you have to report that it has PFAS in it, whatever the products are. The prohibition of PFAS in products, you'll notice, is starting in 2032. So they're giving a lot of lead time to these individuals. Oh, Lord, is that 5 minutes? Or okay, that's fine. And again, pesticide regulations effective January 1st, 2030. So they're looking at sort of the long-term ways that manufacturers of these chemicals or individual companies that are distributing products or selling products with those chemicals in them can find ways to have safer alternatives or figure out ways to phase out those products from using PFAS entirely. And then, of course, drinking water standards. So they have right now for 6 compounds in public water systems to ensure safe drinking water in their systems. Another federal level law that has been introduced, again by the Maine contingent in Congress, is the Relief for Farmers Hit with PFAS Act. So this is a federal legislative proposal aimed at supporting farmers specifically who have been affected by contamination from PFAS. It was introduced in 2023, again, Senate and House members from Maine, and it outlines several provisions which are crucial to our agriculture community. It's the establishment of a grant program, first and foremost, aimed at helping states with PFAS contamination. You've got financial support for impacted farmers. You've got development of remediation and transition plans You've got improvement of testing and monitoring resources, and then you've got educational initiatives for farmers. This is the way that we need to approach PFAS in Kentucky. We need to support this passing federally so that every state has this consistent approach, but even if it doesn't, we have this roadmap, right? We know what works. And this kind of a bill includes all of those provisions that safer states laid out in their pathways to safer solutions to PFAS. So this is something that we need to be looking at again in Kentucky in terms of how we move forward with legislation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my bills. I got introduced to PFAS. I had no idea what it was. It took me until this session to figure out how to say per and poly. I'm not going to try it. But PFAS. So explaining what it is, right, to legislative colleagues, explaining what it is to people that have never heard of this and why it's so scary and why it's so important for them to be involved and be informed and be aware that it is, prevalent in their communities. And it's prevalent in their bodies and in the food systems and everything around them potentially that they are consuming. And it sounds terrifying, so you have to take different bites at the apple. So from 21 to 23, I essentially focused on the drinking water limits, right? So monitoring and regulating our drinking water systems and any water discharge into the Commonwealth, into our rivers and our streams, based on EPA limits at the time, but also requiring that those chemical limits be designed to protect public health and be updated as the science evolves. The change in 2024 and 2025 to that was really based on discussions that I had with different stakeholders and the lack of data sharing, right? The lack of just discussions and not researching and doing testing in silos and understanding really where these hotspots are, where these concentrations are. So that's where I shifted my focus in terms of legislation to establishing a PFAS working group. So the PFAS working group will review the latest research, it will share state-level data, it will consult with federal, state, or local agencies, nonprofits, any other impacted stakeholders or stakeholders that may have information that we could all use to help inform our strategies moving forward, and then develop recommendations for the mitigation of the impact on health outcomes. So you've seen what other states have done, and what the point of this working group is to figure out concentrations of PFAS in Kentucky based on health outcomes. So if we have clusters of certain conditions that are linked to PFAS that have been linked, for instance, in the lawsuits that were mentioned by Jamie, that Rob Bilott has worked on for the past few decades, that needs to be the focus, not EPA limits, not arbitrary sort of numbers and guidelines that will, of course, change almost as soon as they're issued. What we need to look at is how are PFAS making our Kentuckians sick? Finding concentrations and focusing our remediation and mitigation efforts there so that it is not as expensive as it needs to be, because it's not going to be a blanket approach. It cannot cost the same in every county because the concentrations are different. So that is the approach that I have taken. And really, a lot of it is geared towards just getting these folks in a room. So it mandates like the commissioners of Fish and Wildlife, the Energy and Environment Cabinet, the universities. So it kind of forces everyone into the room to talk about this, to figure out what they've done and what we all can do moving forward. And I'll stop there. I'm sure I've moved past my time, but thank you very much. I will say that the one thing that needs to happen more of is testing. There's a lot of private wells, there's a lot of private land that needs to be tested, but if we can figure out an approach and allocate funding and support to farmers, that's going to be the key. You have to do it all in conjunction, and we all are going to have to do it together. So I urge you all to reach out to us or figure out ways in which we can collaborate to make sure that if you want to test, you want to sample, that you're able to do so without impacting your businesses and your farms. Thank you very much. Yes, Fitz, we're ready for you.
Okay,
Yeah,
hi.
my understanding is you don't have a slide presentation we'll be listening to you, right?
No, I don't. I
Okay.
don't. Last and certainly least, I I appreciate this opportunity. This is an amazingly informative panel thus far, and hopefully I'll add a little bit to it. Um, uh, it is a privilege to be here. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I ended up having to do a major filing on some mining issues. It's I guess a sign of the times. I'm helping to defend a Biden administration regulation that tried to restore citizens' rights on mining issues that had been undone by the Trump administration and which has been targeted by the Project 2025 folks for undoing yet again. So I feel like I'm on a little bit of a merry-go-round. But I wanted to share with you all so kind of put this in perspective. We have in Kentucky a number of issues related to environmental pollution, environmental contamination, that we have programs in place to limit pollution from sources in the air and land and water moving forward. And there are limits that are being imposed on on the manufacturing of PFAS, on certain uses, as Jamie mentioned, in terms of bans on use in packaging. We have put in place in Kentucky the only regulatory mandate that I'm aware of dealt with firefighting foam. That was done a couple of years ago. And so we have going forward actions that are being taken, but we also have a tremendous legacy of environmental contamination associated not only with PFAS, but with the utilization of any number of compounds that have proven to be very durable in the environment. PCBs, as another example of a compound which was valued for its chemical durability and has become a blight for that very same reason. Um, I became very involved in PFAS issues a couple of years back because of an effort on the part of a couple of cities who then enlisted the League of Cities in changing the state's management of sewage sludge, or so-called quote unquote biosolids that are land applied on agricultural land. And before I talk about that particular issue, I just wanted to kind of put this in perspective. If there are, as Jason showed, any number of sources where PFASs have been utilized and get released into the environment. Certain types of firefighting foam, dry cleaners. There are certain standard industrial codes or SIC codes where you have industries, electroplating, a number of other types of industries where PFAS compounds have been utilized and have been released into the environment. Typically, when we're looking at former sites where a hazardous substance or pollutant or contaminant has been released in the environment, um, we have a fairly discrete set of those sites that we're looking at. For example, the Superfund program, which was created by Congress in 1980 to to address and remediate places where hazardous substances were managed in the past and may be released in the environment, old landfills, old industrial sites. Those are a fairly discrete set, although there's still a lot of them need to be addressed, sites that we know of. One of the things that is particularly problematic about PFAS is that they are much more ubiquitous in the environment, in soil and in groundwater and in surface water. And one of the efforts that the state of Kentucky has been involved in under the current management of the Department of Environmental Protection. In fact, I was talking to Commissioner Tony Hatton just this morning about it, is to try to map those areas in Kentucky. And I think that there was map that you saw from the environmental working group, to map those areas where you anticipate that there may be contamination from PFAS. Because our groundwater systems are so diverse and in some cases don't filter pollutants very well, particularly in karst terrain or fracture flow terrain in some of the more mountainous areas, um, we have the ability for PFAS to migrate and to travel in the natural environment in groundwater. Uh, and so it is, when you map the potential sources of PFAS releases or PFAS contamination with the sources of or individual wells or small public water systems, it is an issue of significant concern and is going to take a lot of resources in order to test and in order to attempt to remediate the contamination. And of course, one of the first things you try to do is to identify whenever you have a potential for contamination, what are the pathways of exposure and how do you eliminate or cut off those pathways of exposure so you no longer have the public or sensitive environmental resources being exposed to these hazardous substances. So specific to farmland, because you are an association that is looking at organic agriculture, I doubt that many, if any, of the folks are utilizing biosolids or sewage sludges of any kind for fertilizer value. But there have been and continue to be a number of agricultural lands in the Commonwealth where the sewage sludges or so-called biosolids have been land applied. And I think it's safe to say that in most of those cases, if you do any sampling, you are going to find levels of PFAS that may be of human health concern. And I say of human health concern, we have limits that we set, we have advisory limits that are set, but there are no levels at which there is therapeutic benefit from being exposed to this particular family of chemicals or any of the other many of the families of chemicals that are legacy chemicals that you find in the environment. So, in terms of biosolids and the regulation of biosolids, Kentucky for many years had a program to control the land application of sewage sludge. And that program, uh, because Kentucky was managing it in a way that they were attempting to protect groundwater and placing, in recent years, taking more seriously the screening of these sewage sludges because of concerns about industrial chemicals cycling through the environment and being part of many of these sewage sludges, particularly in cities where you have industrial sources that are discharging into the same sewer system as residences and commercial establishments, so that your sewage sludge, some of the heavy metals, some of the other pollutants are tending to partition out into these solids that are then being land applied. There was an effort by some cities, unfortunately backed by the League of Cities, to force the Energy and Environment Cabinet to modify its regulations in order to conform to a federal set of regulations called the 503 regulations. Now, understand the federal regulations were adopted in 1992. And they regulate a grand total of 9 pollutants. Now, EPA's own Inspector General in 2018 looked at the safety of the biosolids program and, based on EPA's own data, identified 352 other pollutants that were in the sludges that had been tested by EPA from 1989 through 2015. In that family of 352 other pollutants. 61 of them were designated as acutely hazardous, or priority pollutants under other regulatory programs. And so, according to the Inspector General, EPA's controls over these land application of sewage sludges may not, quote, fully protect human health and the environment. Now, the legislature adopted in 2023 a mandate under Senate Bill 213 to the cabinet to revise its regulations in order to address biosolids, and the cabinet did so. I opposed those regulations and did so because they are underprotective of the farmers who might accept these biosolids, and they are underprotective of the environment. And they are underprotective because they don't require screening or sampling for PFAS. They don't require that the the results of any sampling be reported to farmers. So in the interest of time, what I'm going to suggest to you is a couple of things. One is I'm going to send Shannon a number of fact sheets that have been developed, because just last week, the EPA finally issued a draft risk assessment on the risks of the land application of sludges to farms. And it indicates that there are elevated levels of risk from land application of these biosolids in many cases that are above what are considered to be acceptable levels. There are things that you can do, both to, that hopefully we can explore in the question and answer, both to find out whether lands that you own, lands that are near your farmlands, lands that you might consider using or cropping, have had past land application of biosolids. There are, as Jason mentioned, resources available to assist you in sampling drinking water if you're using groundwater, and also irrigation water. And there are efforts by legislators such as NEMA to address these. They are going to need your voices. They're going to need you to ask questions, to raise the issue, to educate your decision makers at the state and the federal levels on these risks, to become informed yourself. And there are some resources out there. I appreciate Oak making this an issue today, because it is an emerging concern. There are other emerging pollutants out there, but this particular family of chemicals are ubiquitous in the environment. And unless you are educated about them, unless you are cautious, could end up becoming a contamination problem for the lands that you are managing and the crops that you're producing. So with that, I'm going to turn it back for question and answer. But I will be sending a number of resources to help you become more informed about the recent risk assessment, the work that's being done on the national level. Unfortunately, the Trump administration just pulled the plug on proposed drinking water standards that had been announced by the previous administration, which I think is a real shame as well as a threat to public health. But there are there's some good, solid information out there that you can utilize to help protect your interests, your lands, and your communities. So I'll send it back to Shannon, and hopefully we'll get some good questions and answers.
Thank you so very much. And thank you to our speakers who have joined us on the stage here. We still have Dr. Wise online with us as well. We've gotten a lot of questions submitted via Slido, so thank you all so much, and you can keep voting up questions and submitting as well. We had a lot of folks ask, can farmers easily find where biosolids have been applied in Kentucky on the land throughout the years? Is there perhaps a place we can look?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You can't find with absolute certainty, okay? But you can send an open records request, and you can do it electronically through eec.kora, or go to the Energy and Environment Cabinet's website and do an open records request and give the ask for any records of the agency on land application of sewage sludges or biosolids, and give them the address and the coordinates of the properties. They do maintain a database of all of the permits, and you can screen that database for land farms, and you can screen it by the lands that it has been applied, because they are required to be reported. Now, unfortunately, that's not going to give you everything, because, for example, some of the cities, Louisville was one of them, marketed the sewage sludges as fertilizers commercially, so that you could go and order a bag of them and apply them. So some of the applications, and it's the same stuff that's being applied. And so you're not going to be 100% certain, but you can get some of that information from the cabinet to the extent that they have that data to find out where there has been past land application. And you may also check with the cities in your locality as to whether they have land applied or have released their sewage sludges to be land applied. A lot of it happens more locally because of the cost of transporting it distances. So you can check and see. Many cities, sewage treatment plants, they send the sludges to landfills rather than releasing them for land application by farmers. So ask locally of your municipal sewage treatment plants, the way that they manage it. Ask your neighbors, ask the person that you bought the property from, but you can also ask the state under the Open Records Act for any records they might have.
Thank you. And do you all have anything to add, and or do you have any comments about what the extent of PFAS contamination in the soil in Kentucky in particular is at this point?
Yeah, I don't think we really know the answer to that question. I actually asked this exact same question of Fitz, because it's a great question when we kind of prep for this. And I think in terms of the potential sources, it seems to be clustered within Louisville metro area, Lexington, and northern Kentucky. I mean, there are other areas throughout the state where there are industrial sources, but if you're near one of those metro areas, you know, because of the cost of transport of those biosolids, I know in Lexington for a while at least, one of the wastewater treatment plants was sending sludge off for land application. And then in addition to that product, Louisville Green, that Fitz alluded to, that was a product that was sold to homeowners. The city of Milwaukee sold a product called Milorganite that's also sewage sludge based. So, in addition to our farms that are, businesses and large, home gardeners and folks growing things at home might want to think about whether those products have been applied as well.
This question is likely for you, Nima. We've had quite a few people asking if you could reiterate what the potential legislation we could see in Kentucky in the area of PFAS might be, and where Kentucky folks could advocate to make change.
Hello? Okay. So the bills I outlined were just approaches that I had kind of come up with, speaking to different environmental groups, different advocacy groups. I would welcome your feedback in terms of how it impacts you specifically, right? Your industries, your businesses, because what we are going to have to do is implement policy like Maine that is comprehensive. So that doesn't just look at, identifying sources, That's one thing. We have to protect farmers. There are states that provide liability protection. And again, you have a transition phase to allow farmers, to allow industries to transition out of the practice of using those specific PFAS compounds that are considered unsafe, regardless of how many carbon chains there are. So if it's unsafe and they're continuing to create different variations of the same toxic chemical, that's not helping anybody. So we have to make sure that we're doing all of those things in conjunction. You will see probably me focusing on this working group because I think that's an opportunity for public input. It's an opportunity for stakeholder input. It's an opportunity for data sharing and for research. So that is the approach that you'll see from me. But having looked at Maine's, the federal level, relief for farmers impacted by PFAS, or hit by PFAS, that bill I think is critical. And so something along those lines on a state level, you will probably see me introduce as well, because it provides funding, it provides protection for farmers, and it takes into consideration how specifically farmers are impacted, and that's going to be critical in any approach that we have on a policy level here in Kentucky. Did that answer the question?
I would also add, among Kentucky legislators, what is your perspective on the quantity of legislators that are interested in or aware of PFAS, and perhaps just thinking about the geography of the state covered by participants here, that might be critical in their understanding. It'll come on. Mm-hmm.
Hello? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Education, like I said, when I first started talking about PFAS, nobody had a clue what I was talking about. Nobody could pronounce it. Nobody, like forever chemicals, nobody had heard of this. The most recent, I think we had a series of articles about South Shores, and then there was a facility in Henderson. But that's all industry specific. So even for my simple little, find out how much PFAS is in drinking water and regulate it, we got pushback from the industry. I've had bipartisan support for all of this legislation, so that should tell you something. And if you frame it in the sense of how did we identify and mitigate the issue of lead poisoning, that's the level, right? Lead, asbestos, like this is how we need to be looking at PFAS through a public health angle. That's something people understand. When their people are getting sick, when their neighbors are getting sick, when you have the potential for people getting sick, especially when you're talking about PFAS being in children's blood, in newborn blood, it's bioaccumulative, and so all of the science and those words don't necessarily mean anything, but when you break it down into things like, do you want your kids exposed to lead? Would you want your family exposed to asbestos? That makes it a little easier to understand. Education is the key, I will say, because when I first started talking about it, nobody knew. And in order to get past the industry pushback, which is the same things you're gonna hear, we're within whatever the limit set by the EPA, we are within whatever the thresholds are for the materials that we're making, there's no other alternative, so we have to use PFAS. Those types of excuses, we have to find a way to overcome that, because the industry knows about this and they have answers for legislators that have questions about PFAS. So we have to be on our side proactive in how we talk about PFAS and how we approach the mitigation part of it. But I think there is absolutely scope for bipartisan support for legislation, at least starting to address PFAS contamination in Kentucky.
Thank you so much for expounding on that. There's a question that says, Maine is currently testing PFAS remediation with biochar application, and folks are wondering if that's something that our researchers have heard of, or if Kentucky is looking into that.
Yeah, so
It'll come on. He's watching you, yeah.
biochar does a pretty good job with the long chain PFAS compounds, the 8-carbon chain, but it doesn't do a very good job lining up the short chain. The more effective or granulated activated carbon is a product, and they're very expensive. So it could help, but it's not going to, immobilize products. Do you want me to? I thought it was on. Sorry. I'll just repeat that for the folks at home. Biochar is good for the long chain PFAS compounds, the 8-carbon chain ones, but it's not as effective for the short chain is REM-bind, or the granulated activated carbon. But there are a lot of folks all over the world researching this right now in ways to optimize treating the soil. So it's a topic of intense research right now.
Thank you. Anything else, Fitz? Any other perspective on that?
No, I think what you're going to see in the next, because as Jason said, this is becoming a very, the issue is surfaced and is becoming a topic of discussion. I tend to monitor what goes on in the waste industry, and there is a whole growth industry now about attempting to find technological solutions to remediate contamination. Right. And so that will continue to happen. The cost of testing has come down from what it used to be. There are certain test methods that EPA is using that are more broad spectrum because, as Jamie mentioned, it's not only, you originally thought you're dealing with 9,000, now you're dealing with 14,000 chemicals, and there is the second generation of chemicals which are developed that have their own problems. So there are limited you can. And the first thing is finding out where it is, right? And that is the sampling is extremely important. And I would encourage folks to have to if you're using groundwater, to get it sampled. If you want to know what sort of land application, what sort of activities have occurred within a 4 or 5 mile radius of your lands, there are ways to find out if there are past activities that could have resulted in releases of PFAS. And so I think becoming educated and in turn educating decision makers is very important.
Round of applause to our speakers. I invite everyone to keep this energy going. We do have a session next up that has to do with policy with the Community Farm Alliance. So please look for that in your packets. Brooke is at the door collecting surveys, so please complete your session feedback card and hand that into her before you leave. Thank you so much.